past, present and future. As Jim pointed out, we are on the land of people that came before us. In Australia, whilst sometimes that sort of acknowledgement might seem token, we have still got a long way to go to understand what the true meaning of being welcome on to country and allowed to speak on country and what that means from an Indigenous perspective. I want to also acknowledge and thank the Blood Foundation and in particular Benjamin Francis Bowler, who has over the last 3 years inspired many of us, his own family, many of his friends, taking on a challenge in a context that most people never see, never think about, never encounter. Ben found himself there by a range of different means, but once he got there, his commitment and his connection to that place, the northern Thailand, Burmese border region, what he's doing up there and what he's trying to inspire and stimulate around there is a great story, and it's an example of how you take the sorts of concepts that we're talking about at this Parliament and apply them in the real world, and really, at the end of it all, that's where we need to be going. I want to acknowledge Jim as I've done. I feel incredibly privileged to be able to speak after Professor Jim Bowler. Jim's known me since I was 15 years of age. I was a nit running around with his son for a few years, and ever since. It was my first encounter of, I guess, the Australian Indigenous context was going out to Mungo with Jim and Ben in a ute, 3 of us in the front seat, 8-hour drive up to the lake at least. Whilst Jim was running around looking at all the important things, Ben and I were running around creating all sorts of havoc. It's incredible to see that somehow Jim, even in that context, managed to sow a seed of inspiration, because it's certainly affected me, and I think it's affected both of us over a longer run. And I think Jim, you probably won the argument in the end. Now, mine is a secular baldness, so my lack of hair is not that of the spirit, at least not so far as I know. Now, I come into this with a healthy and active interest in spirituality, but I'm still an explorer, and I'm not a colonist when it comes to spirituality. So I just want to make that clear. I'm not speaking from a very sound basis of what you might call religious or even spiritual philosophic knowledge. I'm speaking today from an engagement with the world which is primarily secular. But the challenge for me in being brought into this by the Blood Foundation and Ben and his family was to bring my work, to try and think about how my work, what I do in a professional sense, into this kind of forum. I mean, I'm used to speaking to Aboriginal people about development issues. I'm used to speaking to bureaucrats, Lord help me, about development issues in the Indigenous world, sometimes both. And I have to admit, I swallowed very, very hard, long and deep when I was asked to come and speak about the concepts that I'm always talking about in my professional work in this sort of forum. But the process of thinking about it and how I might bring my work into this kind of forum has been a very revealing process. And so what I'm about to present are some starting concepts, I suppose, but I'm wanting to emphasise the practical primarily, and we'll get to that. How could a very secular thing like development become a demonstration of the kind of convergence that Jim has taken us through and that we've all been exploring over the last week? How could something like development become a demonstration of convergence in action? From where do I speak? This is important, this stuff, because I think it gets overlooked, but it's useful to set the context, and bear with me as I work through this, because it was by going through this process that I think I discovered how I could get to this point where I could talk about my professional background in development planning and this kind of project that we're engaged in this week. Firstly, I'm not an Indigenous Australian, so I can't speak for, and I don't claim to speak for Indigenous people in this country, but I can speak from the perspective of a person, a non-Indigenous person in Australia who has engaged with Aboriginal people and what that experience has been like. I am from Welsh stock, so I'm Indigenous to Wales, to North Wales. In fact, even more importantly to point out, I'm from the Isle of Anglesey, which was a centre of Druidic culture until the Romans came along and took our land, and then the English came and reinforced that over many centuries, of course. But the Welsh are very harmonious people, and that's evidenced by our ability to sing. So the first concept of harmony comes into my soul, I think, my spirit, through the fact that I'm Welsh, as simple as that. I think what's really important for me these days about Wales as a country in Europe is that despite everything that's happened to it in its longer term history, you travel around Wales today and it's one of the few countries in Europe, certainly in the English-speaking parts of Europe, primarily Britain of course, where you'll see the Welsh language, living, breathing Welsh language on road signs and in general usage. So it's quite a testament to how culture and identity can survive despite its trials and tribulations. And that's an important point to keep in mind as we go through what I'm talking about right now. The other aspect of my identity was around about the age of 16. For whatever reason, I became curious in Eastern philosophy. My mum has been a very supporting mum. As a young child, I was given every room to think about and consider the world from my own perspectives. I wasn't given a framework, I suppose. But I can remember reading a book by Lao Tzu, I think it's the Tao Te Ching, at a very young age, and reading it, and it was completely incomprehensible to me, but something was going on in that book that made me think about it. Just think about it. But it was far too complicated for me to get into at a younger age, so I started exploring my interest in Eastern philosophy through a couple of other means, one of which was to study a martial art called Aikido. And one of the core principles of Aikido as a martial art is it's about harmonising the energy of the attacker into the energy of the defender and turning that energy back into the attack that you might receive. A very different and a new concept to martial arts, to traditional martial art. Most martial art was about force and defence. This was about harmony and defence. So a second stream of harmony came into my identity through this kind of exploration. The third part of my identity is that my first degree at university was a very secular one. I was trained in town planning, of all things. But as I explored town planning more and more, I realised that town planning was really about strategy. And a good way of thinking about town planning in terms of the usefulness or planning as a science is this idea of taking a jigsaw puzzle, a bunch of pieces that are just all mixed up and making sense of them. So the jigsaw puzzle picture that you see up there was the first part of my identity that was formed by, I guess, my education, my secular education. The second part of my identity that was formed in that way was when I decided to change track for a little while and became trained as a lawyer and practiced as a barrister for a few years in Queensland. I heard the talk this morning and it was by Hans Kuhn. The talk this morning by Hans Kuhn, and he was talking about law not being